The impact of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs may be rearing their ugly head on the American people. New numbers out today show the U.S. economy shrank by 0.3% in the first quarter of this year, and that hasn't happened in 3 years. U.S. President Donald Trump is putting the blame on his predecessor.
That's Biden. That's not Trump, because we came in on January, this is quarterly numbers, and we came in and I was very against everything that Biden was doing in terms of the economy.
So could this GDP contraction be the start of a U.S. recession? Justin Wolfers is a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Justin Wolfers, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here today, sir.
A pleasure, mate.
So the U.S. economy did something it hasn't done since COVID. It shrank. What do you make of the data we got today?
Actually, a whole lot less here than meets the eye. So very flashy headline, the US economy shrank, and that feels like the first step in a recession two-step. But there's been something very unusual happening. You might have noticed that we have a new leader here in the United States, and he's very pro-tariff. And the thing is, if people know there's tariffs coming, what they're going to do is they're going to go out and buy stuff in March before the tariffs arrive.
Right.
Now, what that means, in turn, is that the amount of money we're spending no longer bears a clear relationship with what we're producing, because a lot of the money we're spending is on stuff other people are producing. That throws a wrinkle into our whole systems of economic measurement. You don't really want to know how the GDP sausage is made, but let me just say it's bits and pieces and scraps, all of which are imperfect, and they're imperfect in ways that usually work pretty well, but work particularly badly at a moment like this. So looking backwards, I don't actually think this number tells us very much. Having said that, it's only dated for January, February, March. Mm-hmm. Liberation Day, the big tariff upheaval started on April 2. So if there's a moment when the US economy cracked, it was early April, and we still haven't seen any of the hard data for April.
Okay, but Donald Trump was talking about tariffs in November when he got elected, and the fiscal quarter for the end of 2024 ended pretty good. There was strong growth. Markets responded well for the fourth quarter. And then we go into this. So what do we make of that kind of a shift? I know you said people are kind of changing some of their behavior in anticipation of the tariffs to avoid those higher costs. But is there a weakening of any sort in the overall U.S. economy, from his election up to Liberation Day? Because there sure was market turmoil.
So here's where we want to talk about different types of economic indicators. Mm-hmm. So hard data is what are people making, how many people have jobs, what are people buying. We only have hard data through to March. These are very reliable data, and they seem to suggest that the US economy kept going pretty well through to March. The exception is that GDP data that came out today, but which I'm warning you is particularly confounded by all of this tariff stuff. Second set of data we have is what's going on in financial markets. Financial markets are people betting, buying and selling based on the future profitability of American business. Financial markets have been very, very unhappy. So that's them effectively betting on the future, saying that American business is going to be less profitable. The only really real data we have for post-Liberation Day is surveys asking people about their expectations of the future, how they feel, what they expect the economy to do, and so on. Those soft data, they're all in the tank. So Trump has absolutely succeeded at making the American people miserable. And we're pretty much here in full-time recession watch. US households are worried. They're aware of what the economic threat is over their heads, and they're making plans. But we haven't yet seen it in the hard data.
Okay, that's interesting. So he hasn't completely tanked the GDP just yet, just the expectations and mood of Americans about where that GDP is going. But we are seeing some other data, Professor, that shipping containers, for example, coming back from China and other places, come back empty because the tariffs are in place, and a lot of these things are inputs that people use for the things that are made in the U.S. and then sold in the U.S., and that is a big five-alarm fire for a lot of people. Explain the significance of that.
Right. So, David, this now is the effect of the tariffs, and this now is the hard data, and this is how things roll out. So at some point, they're not even going to send the empty ships. They're just going to stop sending the ships. So one part of this is totally unsurprising. If you put 145% tariff on someone, it's going to be very hard for people to want to buy that stuff with a 145% markup. What is it we buy from China? So you're probably well aware we buy toys and toasters and plastics and iPhones. But actually one of the other major inputs we buy is equipment and machinery. And so, one way of saying this is every factory around the world can order the machinery that it needs without a 145% upcharge, except American factories.
Right.
So if I owned an American factory, I'd be extremely angry about having been made so uncompetitive. Now, the thing to be clear about here is I shouldn't be angry at Beijing. It's not Beijing that made that equipment more expensive. It's Washington. And so that's part of, so as you put yourself in the shoes of that factory, and that's part of the economic shock that is to come, which is if you stop the ships coming, a whole lot of people are going to have to figure out very quickly how to do things very differently. We tried to do that during COVID. It's very hard. We know that with a Windows computer, if you turn it off and you turn it back on again, it probably works better. But we're pretty sure that's not how economies work.
Well, yes. I mean, he's hitting the U.S. companies from a productivity perspective, from a competitiveness perspective. Hiring is slowing down by a lot of the hard data we're seeing. And even if he were to achieve his dream of repatriating all of this manufacturing, it's not clear they even have the labor pool or the workers with the desire to work in a blast furnace or an assembly factory, certainly not a garment factory. But, we don't know exactly what the hard data will be, but it seems pretty clear, Justin Wolfers, that if contraction in the first quarter wasn't quite there, second quarter looks pretty likely, and if there's no change, third quarter almost certain, and the costs and the slowdown over the next 6 months seem like they're pretty inevitable.
I think there's probably if Trump continues on this course, I think there's probably a 75% chance we end up in recession. Wow. You've just painted, David, I think very accurately the story for why we should be worried and on recession watch. Let me talk about the other 25% because I want to be balanced. The truth is that the single best indicator for how an economy is going to do in the future is how it's been doing in the recent past. And apart from this morning's number, the US economy came into this with a lot of momentum. So think about it as a big cruise liner just moving forward. The question is, did we just hit an iceberg and we're about to sink? Or is the momentum going to carry us through? So you and I are talking about tariffs. We're thinking about tariffs. Anyone who's in an export-oriented field is thinking about tariffs. Anyone who imports inputs is thinking about tariffs. But there are still vast swathes of the economy that are largely unaffected. And the question is, will those swathes of the economy keep the momentum going? It is very hard to stop an economy with momentum. Trump seems to be trying pretty hard, but it's possible we keep moving on.
Well, here in Canada, we feel a little bit like the tugboat or the dinghy that's maybe being pulled by that giant cruise liner. And if it goes down, I mean, we get pulled down with it. Like we've been pulled up by the U.S. economic strength because of our integration. But the downside risk for this country, for a foreign policy and a trade policy, it does not support and does not control. It's pretty enormous. So if the 75% probability that you give it comes true, I mean, where do you see Canada going? Where do you see the global economy going? Because in no scenario does a trade war between the U.S. and China make everyone richer.
Right. So we've talked about the odds of a U.S. recession, and now you say, let's expand it to the world. So very high chance of a U.S. recession, every reason to be worried. Let's talk about the rest of the world, and I'm going to put Canada aside for the moment, despite knowing that's where your viewers are. So for other countries, the thing to realize is the U.S. is fighting 192 trade wars at once. Every other country, Australia, England, Germany, France, is only fighting one trade war. The US only accounts for 1/10 of global trade. So that means if an Aussie needs somewhere to sell their beef, there's lots of other places that they could go. And in fact, one of my favorite anecdotes is apparently in China, Texas barbecue is very popular. They used to serve Texas steaks. Those became very expensive, so now they're buying Aussie beef.
Right.
So you can see how at the end of that story, the Chinese are getting their beef, the Aussie farmers are selling their stuff, and it's the American farmers who are getting hurt. So as the rest of the world has plenty of other friends to look to. And so I'm much more optimistic that we might avoid a global recession. Now, Canada's a special case because it's not the US and it is part of the world, but it's that part of the world that's right next to the US. And the links between Canada and the US are so much stronger than, say, those between Australia and the US, that even if I could be optimistic about the world, it's hard for me to tell a story where the US goes down without dragging Canada with it.
Yeah, that's the big concern. And it's not just the economic ties, it's the diplomatic ones, the security and defense arrangements. It's destabilized our election. It's probably going to destabilize the relationship. So one last question for you, Professor. I have not studied the American consumer or economics anywhere near your level of depth on this, but my understanding of the American consumer is that they might be the least suited cohort of people for short-term pain for long-term gain. It's very much, I want it and I want it now and I want it cheap. So how long do you think the boiling point is in the U.S. before there is real severe pushback against this if prices start going up and jobs start going down?
Not only is the US consumer not well suited to short-term pain for long-term gain, they're actually facing short-term pain for long-term pain. I have been struck, and as an Econ 101 instructor, pleased by the extent to which the American public has understood the underlying economics of this. If you look at surveys, they're profoundly anti-tariff. They've given up on the Trump administration's economic management. They're about as angry at the White House as a lot of people in Canada might be right now, and I know that takes a lot. And so there's a level of economic literacy outside the White House that unfortunately there's not inside the White House. Trump's polls are falling, and they're falling right now. Consumer confidence is falling. People understand what's happening to the world around them, and they're really angry about it.
Justin Wolfers, Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of Michigan. It was really good to meet you, sir. Thanks for being on our show today.
A pleasure, David.